the lesson, I entitled it Begin, or in the Nike tradition, I guess, just begin, dude. And I've used an Old Testament passage out of Zechariah, one of the Old Testament prophets, chapter 4, verse 10. And I'm not taking this out of context, and I will help kind of fill you in where this verse fits in terms of what God is saying to the prophet Zechariah. But for purposes of the lesson this morning, it's a great passage to talk about beginnings. And it says the following: "Do not despise these small beginnings, for the Lord rejoices to see the work begin." I wanted to share with you a story that most of you are probably aware of. After World War II, Germany was completely destroyed. Citizens were desperate for supplies. Russia had established blockades to prevent food trucks and ships and any kind of cargo from coming in, especially to West Berlin, because they wanted to make sure that the devastation to Germany was complete. And so people were looking for ways to help, and the United States and the British armies responded with what was called the 1948 Berlin Airlift. And for 11 months, they airdropped tons and tons and tons of food to over 2.5 million people in West Berlin. And the picture that you see up there is one of the pilots. His name is Gail Halvorson. And Gail was one of those pilots that piloted the plane. But after landing in Berlin one day, this 27-year-old pilot was walking about, and he was talking with 30 or so young German children through a barbed wire fence. And though hungry and needy and without much in the way of clothes or shelter, they never complained and they never begged. And this really impressed Halvorson. So he reached into his pocket and produced 2 sticks of gum. And he broke it in half and handed the pieces through the wire. And here's what he said: "Those kids looked like they had just received $1 million. They put that tiny piece of paper to their noses and smelled the aroma. They were on cloud 9. I stood there dumbfounded." Well, Halvorson was a sensitive man as well. And so he was touched by the plight of these children. And he promised to return the next day and drop more gum from his airplane. But with supply flights coming in basically every half hour into West Berlin, the children said, "Well, how are we going to recognize your plane?" And he said, "When I fly over, I'll wiggle my wings." So Halvorson returned then to Rhine-Main Air Force Base and bought gum and candy rations from his buddies. And he tied all of the sweets to tiny handkerchief parachutes. He loaded them on his C-54 airplane, and true to his word, he wiggled his wings over West Berlin, and the city streets were teeming with children who were running to gather the falling candy. And with that, Operation Little Vittles began in 1948. And momentum for this whole project mounted very quickly. In fact, within 3 weeks, the Air Force had completely sanctioned this activity. And during the following months, United States aircraft dropped 3 tons of candy on the city of West Berlin. Halvorson became known as Uncle Wiggle Wings. That was his name. And I tell you that story to ask you this: do you think small deeds make a difference? Halvorson certainly thinks so. And of greater importance, Jesus does. Here's what he says in Matthew chapter 13, verses 31 through 33. "The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed planted in a field. It is the smallest of all seeds, but it becomes the largest of garden plants and grows into a tree where birds can come and find shelter in its branches." Jesus followed this with an additional illustration. He said, The kingdom of heaven is like yeast used by a woman making bread. And even though she used a very large measure of flour, the yeast permeated every part of the dough. And during Jesus' time, those listeners would have caught on extremely quickly as to what Jesus was saying, because they knew about mustard seeds and they also knew about leaven lumps. Both were small. The mustard seed, as you see up here, is about the size of a freckle. And it takes 750 of those seeds to equal the weight of one paper clip. That's how small they are. They're not very dense either. They're very lightweight. And the leaven that Jesus was talking about is leaven that's no bigger than the tip of your thumb. Yet a tiny mustard seed can erupt from the ground and reach for the clouds, and it can grow to 3 times an average person's height. Can you imagine that? Something that small can grow to be that large, and then house birds who are looking for a place to nest. And a pinch of fermented dough can feed 40 people 3 meals a day for several days. Just one little pinch of leaven feeding 40 people 3 times a day for several days. You see, what begins minutely or small ends up massively. And maybe the early church needed this kind of reminder, because in the face of what they were going through, I mean, what clout does a tiny little manger and a bloody cross carry in a forest of Jewish tradition and Greek philosophy? How can you have a backwoods movement that's headed up by a rural carpenter and expect to gain any traction in a religious world that's dominated by Epicureans, Stoics, and Gnostics? In fact, the analogy I wanted to share with you is like asking a child with a skateboard to go out and expect him to win the Daytona 500. I mean, it's just impossible. It's not going to happen. And I think sometimes all of us, myself included, fear the smallness of Jesus' story. And that fear can keep that seed from growing within each of us. Because when you think about it, can a Sunday school account about Jesus hold its own in, let's say, an Ivy League institution like, I don't know, Harvard, Yale, Princeton? Do terms like sin and salvation and redemption, do any of those terms even stand a chance against today's humanism and relativism? Apparently, they do. Because where now are the Romans who crucified Christ? Where are the Epicureans who demeaned and debated Paul? Where are the Gnostics who mocked the early church? And the great temples of Corinth, they're dwarfed by this little infant church. Do worshipers still sacrifice to Zeus? No, they don't. But we have believers who meet in a location like this and still sing songs to Jesus. You see, God does very uncommon works through very common, small deeds. A survivor of Hurricane Katrina recounted that as the waters were rising around his house, this particular New Orleanian had to literally swim out of his window. And on his back were his 2 children. And the man eventually found safe refuge atop the very tallest building he could find in his community. Other people soon joined him on this rooftop. And eventually, a small group of people were huddled together on what would be their home for the next 3 days before they were rescued. And after an hour on that building, the man realized that he was literally perched on top of a church. He patted the rooftop and announced to his friends, "We are on holy ground here." And his news then jogged the memory of another roof dweller. She looked around at the area, she crawled to the steeple, she hugged it, and then she told the group, "You know what? My grandmother and my grandfather helped build this church." Now, do you think that woman's grandparents ever thought for a moment that God would use their work to save their granddaughter from a flood? Hardly. I mean, I'm sure Grandma and Grandpa were praying that God would save souls, but probably not in this manner. But they couldn't have ever managed that He would use the church that they helped build to save their grandchild from a hurricane. They had no idea how God would use the work of their hands. And the truth is, neither do we. We don't. What difference do selfless deeds make? Do you ever wonder if the things that you do make any difference at all? I'm envisioning maybe a believer at the crossroads. God has done something really miraculous in his or her life. And maybe that could be you. Maybe it's somebody else. That divine spark starts taking hold in that person's life. And the question is, well, do I douse it and put it out, or do I fan it to flame it into life? Do you ever dare dream that you can actually make a difference? God's answer would be, child, just do something and see what happens. Because that's what he told the citizens of ancient Jerusalem. Now going back to Zechariah chapter 4. Here's the scenario. Now, first of all, I have to admit, this is not the once fabled city of Jerusalem. This actually kind of conveys the thought, but this is Palmyra. This was a temple that was destroyed by ISIS here a year or two ago. But it gives you the idea of what these people were facing. Because you see, in the book of Zechariah, we're talking about a situation in which for 16 years, the temple had laid in complete ruin. They had abandoned the work for 16 years. And there were several reasons why. First of all, there was a lot of opposition challenging the reconstruction of the new temple. There was indifference from the neighbors. But probably most of all, the job that they were considering doing just simply dwarfed them. And here's why. To build the first temple, Solomon needed 70,000 carriers of stone, 80,000 stone cutters, 3,300 foremen, and 7 years to complete. That would be a gargantuan task. It would virtually employ everybody in the city of Escondido and San Marcos, everybody in those communities, all working toward one end, and that's to build this temple. That's how many people were involved, and 7 years to do it. And I'm thinking that these workers faced with the rebuilding of that temple, or maybe the workers beginning with Solomon, probably thought, does my work, does my role mean anything? I mean, is it really that important? I'm only one of 70,000 carriers, or I'm only one of 80,000 stone cutters, or I'm only one of 3,300 supervisors. Does what I do really make any difference? And here's what God says. Zechariah 4:10. Do not despise these small beginnings, for the Lord rejoices to see the work begin. And I think that's the key word in this passage. Begin. Just begin. Just start. What seems small to you might be huge to someone else. And I have an example of that for you. His name is Bone Fox. During World War II, Bone Fox piloted a B-17. And during one mission, he sustained flak from the Nazi anti-aircraft guns. And even though his gas tanks were hit with the flak, and we're talking 20-millimeter shells now, zooming into his airplane, they're striking the gas tank, his plane didn't explode. And Fox was miraculously able to land the plane safely. So the next morning, he calls up his crew chief, and he asks his crew chief to find that shell that pierced his gas tank, because he wanted to keep it as a memento, as a token of God's grace and allowing him to have his life spared. He wanted to keep this souvenir to show and remind him of his good fortune. The crew chief explained that not just one, but 11 20-millimeter shells pierced the gas tank. These aren't like small bullets. These are big, big shells. So 11 of them have pierced the gas tank. Technicians later opened up these shells, and they found that they were devoid of any explosive charge at all. They were empty. Well, with the exception of one. And in that one, they found a carefully rolled piece of paper in the shell, and on it was a message. It was written by a Czechoslovakian factory worker, and the note read, "This is all we can do for you now." You see, church, a courageous assembly line worker was disarming bombs and had scribbled this note. He couldn't end the war, but he could save at least one plane. He couldn't do everything, but he could do something. So he did what he could. You see, church, God does really big things with really small deeds. Against a towering giant, pebbles from a brook, they would be futile, right? And yet God uses them to topple Goliath. Compared to the tithes of the wealthy that were being donated, a widow's 2 coins seemed pretty puny. By today's standards, those 2 coins that she put in would be, in today's standards, less than 1/4 of a penny. And yet, Jesus uses them to inspire us. And in contrast with sophisticated priests and powerful Roman rulers, a cross-suspended carpenter seemed nothing but a waste of life. I mean, few mourned his death, and only a handful of friends actually buried his body. The people turned their attention back to the temple, and why not? I mean, what power does a buried rabbi have? Well, we know the answer, don't we? It has a mustard seed and leaven lump power. It has the power to rise from the dead, and it has the power to change history. You see, in the hands of God, small seeds grow into sheltering trees. Tiny leaven expands into nourishing loaves. Small deeds can change the world. So I'm encouraging you and me to sow that mustard seed, to bury that leaven lump, to make that call or to write that check or to join that committee. Drop some gum from your airplane if you want to. 60 years from now, another soldier might follow your example. Chief Wiggles did. And this isn't Uncle Wiggly Wings of the Berlin Airlift fame. This is Chief Wiggles of Iraq. And like Halverson, his story begins with a child of defense. And like the candy bomber, Halverson, his work began by giving one gift. Because he noticed a little girl crying on the other side of a barbed wire fence. Here's what he said. She was obviously very poor, in her tattered old dress, totally worn out plastic flip-flops, her hair matted against her head, indicating she didn't and hadn't had a bath in a long time, and her skin was blistered from the dirt and from the weather. And this soldier then remembered that he had some toys in his office, so he hurries back to his office, he grabs a few things, and brings the girl the following: a toothbrush, a whistle, and a toy monkey. And as he gave her these gifts, he said her eyes just lit up with unexpressed and previously unknown joy. He posted this experience on his weblog page, and thousands of people responded, asking where they too could send gifts. And Operation Give was born. And the soldier then inherited Halverson's nickname, and he was just called Chief Wiggles. Church, let me just remind you, Moses had a staff. David had a sling. Samson had a jawbone. And Rahab had a string. Mary had some ointment. Aaron had a rod. Dorcas had a needle. And all were used by God. So what do you have? What do you have? God inhabits the tiny seed, and he empowers the tiny deed. John Wesley, the 18th century co-founder of the Methodist Church, said this: "Do all the good you can, by all the means you can, in all the ways you can, in all the places you can, at all the times you can, to all the people you can, as long as you ever can." So, church, don't discount the smallness of your deeds. Because in God's hands, you just never know how big they'll grow. Great acts are made up of small deeds. You know, as I pour through the internet looking for things to use to put up here as kind of aids to the lesson, there's all sorts of fancy things that you can put up there in different stories. But this one, I think, is right. Great acts are made up of small deeds. Another expression that I didn't put up here, but I thought was also appropriate, is a small deed done is better than a great deed imagined. We sometimes think we need to do big things for God, and we get around to doing nothing. Whatever talent, whatever skill, whatever occupation, whatever place in life you have, use that to give God the glory. Use that to change your community. Use that to change that person's world. Because you never know that what you might do today, which might seem so small, ends up having a profound effect, maybe beyond your lifetime. But God can use that to accomplish his will. I'll conclude with this. I've always been fascinated by the parable of the sower. Remember that parable? Jesus talked about a sower going out and sowing. And I used to get all caught up in the quality of the ground where the seed was falling. Remember, the first one was it fell on some really stony ground. And blackbirds came in and started swooping in and taking up the seed. And then another set of ground was it had a lot of rocks in it. And so the seed would grow for a while, but then it had no depth of soil, and so then the plant usually faded away and died. And another one was it had some soil, but in addition to that, it had weeds in it. And so the weeds started choking out the seed. And then the last soil type had good soil and pretty good soil and fairly good soil. I mean, Jesus said some gave 30% increase, some gave 60% increase, some gave 100% increase. And I used to get really involved in trying to evaluate all these seed types. And I'm thinking, well, if I'm the sower and I'm sowing seed and birds are coming in and swooping up my seed, I think I should just chase off the birds. Hey, you dirty birds, quit swooping in and taking all my seed. And if I can chase them off, then I will have accomplished my job. Or if it was too stony, then I'm going to spend a lot of time picking out those rocks. Ah, stupid rocks. You're destroying my plant's ability to grow. Or if it was being choked out with weeds, then I'm going to get on my knees and I'm going to pull the weeds. And when I pull the weeds, what do? I also pull up the good plants with it. And then on that good soil, I'm thinking, well, if some's 30, some 60, some 100, I'm going to go buy some fertilizer to make the 30%ers be the 100%ers. And I think we can get ourselves involved in all that kind of stuff, but do you notice what's not being done? You're not sowing the seed. You can be so focused on this task at hand that it takes you away from what you can do best. To take your talent, to take your small deed, to invest it in another life and see what God can do with it. He's not taking time picking rocks out of soil. He's not taking time chasing birds. And he encourages us to do the same. Just sow the seed. Just do one small deed and see what God can do with it. And as the lesson was titled, Just Begin. That's your challenge this week. Just begin. Just do one small deed and see what changes that might make. Perhaps something you'll see immediately, perhaps something that will happen later on. You never know. But in God's hand, every small deed can turn into a great act. So we've picked out a song to encourage you as it relates to this lesson. If you have a prayer request, now would be an appropriate time to pass it up. As soon as we're done with the song, we'll talk about the prayer request and then we'll be dismissed. Let's stand and sing.